It was the summer of 1998, and I had just taken a seasonal job as a park ranger's assistant in a remote part of Montana. I was 22 years old, broke from college bills, and this job promised solitude, decent pay, and a place to live for a few months. They put me in a small wooden cabin about half a mile from the Maine ranger station, tucked near the tree line. It wasn't anything fancy, just 4 walls, a tin roof, a cot, a wood stove, and a desk. At first, I liked the quiet. The air smelled of pine and wet earth, and at night, the sky was so black you could see every star. During the day, I did rounds on the trails, checked signs, picked up trash, and occasionally helped hikers who got turned around. Most of the time, though, I was alone. That didn't bother me at first. I thought of it as a break from everything noisy in life. I brought a few books, a flashlight, and a notebook. The isolation was almost refreshing. But after a few weeks, I started noticing things that didn't sit right. First, it was small. On one of my early morning rounds, I found fresh footprints in the mud along a closed service path. They weren't boot prints from the rangers, and they weren't from sneakers or hiking shoes either. They looked like work boots, heavier, wider. I followed them for a bit, but they disappeared near a creek bed. I shrugged it off, told myself maybe it was just an old print or a hunter who cut through. Still, it put something uneasy in the back of my mind. That unease grew as the nights stretched longer. My cabin sat far enough from the station that once the sun went down, it was just me and the woods. Sometimes, lying in bed, I would hear movement outside. Not the regular stuff like owls or the snap of a twig under a deer's step. This sounded heavier, slower, more deliberate, person's weight moving close. Once or twice, I heard the crunch of gravel near the door. Each time, I froze, staring at the ceiling, too afraid to breathe. When I finally got the courage to peek outside with my flashlight, there was nothing but black trees staring back at me. By late July, I was exhausted. My sleep was light, broken. I started double-checking the locks on my cabin door and wedging a chair under the knob, even though no one had a key but me. During the day, I kept my eyes open for more footprints. I found them once more, about 200 yards from my cabin, pressed deep into the soil like someone had been standing there a while, facing my cabin. I wanted to report it to the head ranger, but I couldn't bring myself to sound paranoid. It's embarrassing, being the new guy and telling your boss you're scared of noises in the woods. Besides, what could they do? The nearest sheriff's office was 30 miles out, so I kept it to myself. One night, a storm rolled in. The rain came down in sheets, hammering the tin roof, drowning out every natural sound outside. I was sitting at the desk with my flashlight on, trying to write in my notebook, when I heard it again. Only this time, it was unmistakable. Footsteps on the porch. The wood creaked under the weight of someone standing just outside my door. I froze. The storm roared, but underneath it, I could hear the slow, shifting sound of boots moving across the boards. Not fast, not hurried. Just steady, like the person wasn't worried about being heard. I reached for the axe I kept by the wood stove and gripped it until my hands ached. My heart pounded so loud I thought whoever was outside could hear it. Then the footsteps stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing but the drumming rain. I strained to listen, sweat sliding down the back of my neck. Finally, I caught the faint scrape of metal against the door handle. Whoever it was, they were testing it. Slowly, carefully, trying not to make noise over the storm. The chair wedged under the knob held firm, but I sat there frozen in the dark, staring at the door, ready to swing the axe at the first sign of it giving way. After what felt like forever, the handle stopped moving. Silence again. Then, footsteps retreating down the porch and vanishing into the storm. I didn't sleep at all that night. By dawn, when the rain had stopped, I stepped outside, legs shaking, and checked the porch. Sure enough, muddy boot prints were stamped clear across the wood. right up to my door. The kind of boots I'd seen in the mud weeks earlier. That morning, I finally told the head ranger what happened. He looked concerned but not surprised. He told me quietly that sometimes drifters passed through. Sometimes people lived in the forest off the grid, hiding from something or someone. They usually didn't bother anyone, but he admitted there had been a few strange encounters over the years. He didn't say much more, just told me to keep the door locked and carry the radio at all times. That answer didn't ease me. If anything, it made me more uneasy. Whoever it was, they weren't just passing by. They knew where I was. They had stood outside my cabin, in the storm, and tried my door. The last week of July was the hardest. Every sound at night put me on edge. Every shift of wind through the trees made me jump. I hardly slept, and when I did, I dreamed of someone standing in my doorway, watching me. My nerves were so raw, I started carrying the axe even during daylight rounds. On my last night in the cabin, I packed my things early. I was counting the hours until I could leave for good. I sat on the cot with my bag ready, flashlight in hand, axe leaning against the wall. Around midnight, I heard movement again. Slow steps circling the cabin, gravel crunching. A shadow passed across the thin curtains of my window, blotting out the faint moonlight. My throat went dry. Whoever it was stopped by the porch again. The boards creaked, then silence. I didn't move, didn't even breathe. Minutes crawled by like hours. Finally, the shadow shifted away. I listened until the sounds faded completely, then sat there until morning, gripping the axe, staring at the door. When the sun rose, I opened the door and stepped outside. The ground was covered in fresh tracks, circling the cabin again and again, pressed deep into the damp earth. They led into the trees, fading where the shadows grew too thick to follow. That was the last night I ever stayed in that cabin. When I walked away the next morning, bag on my back, I didn't look behind me. I didn't need to. I knew someone had been there night after night watching. I never did find out who it was or what they wanted. Maybe it was just someone drifting through the woods. Maybe someone living out there alone. But the way those prints circled my cabin, the way they tested the door in the storm, it wasn't chance. They wanted in. And to this day, when I think back on that summer, the part that stays with me most is not the sound of the footsteps or the creak of the boards. It's the silence after, the long pause at my door, like whoever it was standing there, listening to me breathe, deciding whether or not to push harder. That silence has never really left me. I had always liked being away from people, not because I hated them, but because I found it easier to think when I was alone. That's what brought me out to a small cabin in the woods of northern Idaho back in the fall of 2011. I was 34 then, working as a mechanic most of the year, and when I could save up enough money and get a few weeks off, I'd retreat into the woods to fish, hunt, and clear my head. The cabin wasn't much. It was an old hunting shack I'd fixed up years before. Just one small room with a stove, a cot, and a few shelves for supplies. It sat about 2 miles off a dirt logging road, surrounded by thick pine and spruce. In the daytime, it felt safe enough. At night, though, the silence out there pressed down hard. Every crack in the woods carried farther than it should. That trip started out like all the others. I spent the first few days setting up, hauling in jugs of water, firewood, and the little food I brought with me. The mornings were cold, with frost covering the ground, and by afternoon the sun barely warmed the trees before sinking back down behind the hills. By the fourth night, I had settled into the rhythm, wake at dawn, walk the ridges with my rifle, return to the cabin by dark. But that night, something changed. I'd finished dinner, just beans heated on the stove, and was sitting on the cot sharpening my knife. The cabin was lit by a small lantern, and outside I could hear the usual noises, the breeze moving branches, maybe a distant owl. Then, somewhere deep in the woods, I heard something different. It was faint, like the sound of branches breaking in a way that didn't match the wind. I put the knife down and listened harder. Another crack, closer this time. Heavy, not like a deer stepping carefully. I told myself it was just an elk or maybe a moose moving through. But something about the rhythm was off. The steps were too slow, too deliberate. I killed the lantern, letting the room fall into darkness. My eyes adjusted to the faint light slipping through the small cabin window. I sat still, listening. The sound came again, nearer now, moving toward the cabin. Minutes dragged by. The steps would come, then stop, then nothing for a while. I strained to hear, holding my breath. Then I realized it wasn't just movement I was hearing. Every so often, there was the sound of something brushing against bark, like a hand sliding across a tree trunk. I felt the weight of the rifle leaning against the wall beside me. My hand rested on it, ready, but I stayed still. Out there in the dark, I couldn't see a thing. My little window only showed outlines of trees and shadows. Then came the sound that turned my stomach cold. A soft, slow drag across the wooden siding of the cabin itself. Just one long scrape, starting near the corner and moving along the wall. I didn't move. Whoever or whatever was out there knew exactly where I was sitting. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, every muscle tight, listening to the night breathe. Eventually, the scraping stopped. The footsteps retreated, fading into the woods until the forest was silent again. I didn't light the lantern. I didn't sleep. I sat up in the dark until the faint light of morning slipped in through the window. When I stepped outside, everything looked normal. Frost on the ground, a thin fog hugging the trees. But on the side of the cabin, I saw it. Marks carved shallow into the wood. Not claw marks, not animal. Straight lines, uneven, like someone had taken a piece of metal or a sharp stick and slowly dragged it along the wall. I felt sick looking at it. My first thought was that someone had been out there messing with me. A hunter, maybe, or some drifter passing through. But why? Nobody came out that far unless they meant to. And no normal person would sneak around someone's cabin at night instead of just knocking on the door. I thought about leaving right then, packing up and heading back to the truck. But I pushed it down, told myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was just kids from town playing a prank, though the nearest town was 20 miles away. I tried to shake it off. The next day, I hunted as usual, but the woods felt different. Every snap of a twig had me turning. Every gust of wind sounded like it carried something behind it. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sun was already dropping low. I forced myself to eat, forced myself to pretend nothing was wrong. That night, the sounds returned. I had left the lantern burning low, the rifle across my lap this time. The first noise came just past midnight. A crack in the trees, closer than before. Then the slow, heavy steps circling. I tried to breathe steady, my chest tight. Again came the scrape, but this time it started right outside the window. A long, drawn-out drag of something sharp across the glass, slow enough that I could hear the vibration hum in the frame. I gripped the rifle so hard my knuckles hurt. The urge to open the door and shout was strong, but fear pinned me down. Whoever was out there wasn't scared of being noticed. They wanted me to know. They wanted me awake, waiting. The scraping stopped after a while, replaced by silence so thick I thought my ears were ringing. I sat frozen for hours, waiting for another sound, but nothing came. When dawn broke, I forced myself outside again. The frost was heavier that morning, and on the ground around the cabin were prints. Not boot prints, not bare feet, but deep, broad impressions, the size of a man's foot but without detail. Whoever it was had walked slow circles around the cabin, pacing, waiting. That was the last night I stayed. By afternoon, I had packed everything and strapped it tight. I didn't wait for dark. I left before the sun even touched the hills, rifle slung, pack heavy on my shoulders. The walk back to the logging road felt endless, every step pulling at my nerves, every sound in the woods making me glance behind. The feeling of being watched never left. I didn't stop to rest. When I reached the truck, the relief hit me so hard I almost dropped to my knees. I tossed the pack into the bed, climbed inside, and turned the engine over with shaking hands. As I drove down that dirt road, dust rising in the mirrors, I promised myself I wouldn't go back. I never did. The cabin still stands out there, I'm sure, rotting slowly into the trees. Maybe someone else has stumbled on it by now, maybe not. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw. It wasn't a ghost, wasn't some story to scare kids. It was something real, someone real, moving with patience, with purpose, in the woods around me. And that was enough. My dad's friend Mark was a retired cop. He had spent over 30 years in the force in Cleveland, and after retirement he decided to get away from everything. He bought a cabin deep in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, about 45 minutes outside a small town called Iron River. The place was simple, just a 2-room wooden cabin with a small loft, sitting close to a ridge where pine trees stood so thick they blocked most of the daylight. The cabin had no neighbors within sight, no cell service, and only a narrow dirt road that wound down to a county road that eventually connected to the highway. I was 23 at the time, and my dad asked me to help Mark out one weekend. He was in his late 50s then, but his knees had gotten bad, and he needed someone younger to carry supplies up from his truck, chop firewood, and help with repairs before the winter hit. I had nothing better to do, so I agreed. I got there in late September of 2009. The air was cold, the kind of cold that sinks into your bones even if the sun is still shining. The dirt road up to the cabin was narrow and muddy, and I remember my truck sliding more than once before I finally saw the cabin come into view through the trees. It looked quiet and lonely, with a tin chimney poking out of the roof and a stack of chopped wood leaning against the side. Mark's truck was already there. He had been living at the cabin full-time since the spring, and he looked like he'd aged 5 years in those few months. His beard had grown out, and his eyes looked tired, but he still had that tough, steady look that older cops carry with them. I unloaded my things, and we spent the first couple hours stacking firewood and hauling supplies inside. The place was sparse but functional, with stove, a table, a couple chairs, a cot, and his bed upstairs in the loft. That first night, after dinner, I sat on the porch while Mark smoked a cigar. The woods were so quiet that even the sound of an owl felt like it carried for miles. What I noticed most was the darkness. I had grown up in the suburbs, so I wasn't used to being somewhere with no streetlights, no distant hum of traffic. Out there, when the sun dropped, it was like the world ended just beyond the glow of the porch light. I didn't think much of it until later that night when I woke up in the pitch black. I couldn't see a thing, not even the outline of the window. It felt like someone had pressed their hands over my eyes. I lay there listening. That was when I heard it. Branches cracking, slow footsteps in the brush. Not an animal. It was too heavy, too spaced out. Something or someone was moving around the cabin. I told myself it was just a deer, probably a buck moving through. But the sound stopped directly outside the wall where I was sleeping. I could hear the faint crunch of leaves being pressed down and then nothing. I lay still for what felt like hours until exhaustion pulled me back to sleep. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. The ground was damp from the night air, and sure enough, there were impressions in the mud near the wall. They weren't hoof prints. They looked like boots, deep enough that the person had been standing there for a while. I didn't mention it to Mark at first. He already had the look of someone carrying too much weight on his shoulders, and I figured it wasn't worth stirring things up. We spent the day patching up a section of the roof and hauling water from a nearby stream. But I couldn't shake the thought of those boot prints. The nearest neighbor was miles away. If someone was out there in the middle of the night, they weren't out for a casual walk. That night, the noises came again. This time it was later, closer to 3 in the morning. I heard the crunch of leaves, the sound of someone dragging their feet slowly. Then the porch creaked. I knew that sound. I had walked across those boards myself earlier that day. Whoever it was, they were standing just feet away from the front door. I wanted to get up, but I froze. Every instinct told me to stay down, to stay quiet. After a few minutes, the boards creaked again, like someone stepping off, and then the footsteps drifted back into the woods. In the morning, I finally told Mark. His reaction bothered me more than the noises. He didn't look surprised. He just nodded slowly and said we'd keep the rifle loaded by the door. That was it. No questions, no theories, nothing. It was like he already knew someone might be out there. We kept busy that day, but the silence between us felt heavier. I started noticing small things. Mark locking the door even in the daytime, glancing out the window every few minutes, keeping his pistol on the table within reach. He'd been a cop for too long to get rattled by nothing. The third night was the worst. It started the same way, soft footsteps circling the cabin, the creak of the porch. But this time there was more than one set. I could hear 2, maybe 3 different rhythms in the crunch of the leaves. They moved around slowly, stopping, starting again. At one point, something brushed against the wall hard enough to rattle the wood. Mark didn't go for the rifle. Instead, he motioned for me to stay quiet. We sat there in the dark, listening. After nearly an hour, the sounds faded back into the woods. The first light, we went outside. The mud and wet leaves told the story clear enough. Multiple sets of boot prints circling the cabin, close, too close. They weren't hunters. They weren't hikers. They had been watching us. I asked Mark if he had any idea who it could be. He finally told me something that made my stomach turn. Before moving out there, he had testified in a case against a couple of guys tied up in meth distribution. One of them had been released on parole that summer. The man knew Mark had retired somewhere in Michigan, though not the exact location. At least that's what Mark thought. We didn't waste time after that. By mid-morning, we packed up what we could into his truck. The plan was simple: drive into town, report what we'd seen, and stay in a motel until we figured out what to do. But when we reached the truck, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The driver's side door handle was scratched up, like someone had tried to pry it open during the night. We drove out fast, tires sliding on the muddy road. I kept looking back through the trees, half expecting to see someone step out onto the road behind us. But the woods stayed still. When we got to town, Mark went straight to the sheriff's office. They sent a deputy back with us later that day, but by then the tracks around the cabin had been trampled by rain. Nothing was left but smears of mud. No one was ever caught, no one was ever questioned, and nothing like that happened again while I was there. Mark never sold the cabin, but he stopped staying there full-time. He came back only in the summers, during the day, and always left before nightfall. He never said it outright, but I knew he was afraid. As for me, I never went back after that trip. I can still remember lying in that cabin in the dark, listening to those footsteps on the porch, knowing someone was standing just feet away with nothing but a thin wooden door between us. It wasn't the kind of fear that comes and goes. It was the kind that sits in your chest for years after, waiting to remind you that some places never feel safe again. It was late autumn of 1998 when I decided to build a small cabin for myself on a piece of land I had bought in the northern woods of Maine. I was 28 at the time, tired of the noise of the town, tired of renting small apartments with thin walls and neighbors who never stopped arguing. The land wasn't much, only 4 acres of dense trees, but it was mine. I figured I could clear a little spot, put up a cabin big enough for me, and use it for hunting season or just for weekends when I wanted to be away from people. That evening, the rain had started just before sunset. It wasn't the kind of drizzle you could ignore. It was steady, heavy enough that every branch above me bowed down and dropped cold water on the back of my neck. I had been working all afternoon, trying to get the frame of the cabin at least standing before the weather got worse. The ground was already muddy, and my boots sank a little deeper each time I moved around. The cabin was small, about 12 by 16 feet, nothing fancy. I had managed to dig out a level patch the week before and lay down a rough foundation of stones and treated wood. The frame was half up by the time the rain got heavier. My hammer kept slipping in my hand, and every swing echoed dull against wet wood. I knew I should have stopped earlier, but I didn't like the thought of leaving everything half-finished and exposed. The air smelled sharp, wet pine mixing with the earthy rot of leaves breaking down under the rain. I told myself I would just get the beams secure enough for the night and then call it quits. By the time I packed away my tools, the light was gone. Clouds hid the moon, and the woods turned into a wall of black. My flashlight cut through it in a narrow cone, but every drop of water falling from branches glittered like little sparks, making the woods look alive in a way that made my stomach tighten. I had brought a small canvas tent to sleep in while I worked on the cabin. It wasn't much, but I had it set up a short distance from the build site, just beyond the tree line. By the time I crawled inside, I was soaked through. My jacket clung to my arms, and my jeans were heavy with water. I changed into the only dry clothes I had and laid back on my sleeping bag, listening to the hammering rain. The sound of it hitting the nylon tent was constant, like 1,000 tiny fingers drumming above me. First, it was almost calming, but the longer I lay there, the more the sound played tricks on me. Underneath the steady rhythm, I kept thinking I heard something else. A thump, a shuffle, the kind of sound you only notice once you're alone and everything else is quiet. I told myself it was just the forest, branches snapping under the weight of water, maybe an animal moving through the underbrush. Still, I found myself holding my breath, waiting, listening. The land wasn't far from an old logging road, but it wasn't near any houses. The nearest neighbor was almost 3 miles away. I had told no one I'd be out here tonight, not even my brother. That thought didn't bother me much in the daylight, but at night, in the middle of the storm, it felt heavier. Sometime past midnight, the wind picked up, and the tent walls pushed inward with each gust. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there. I got up, unzipped the flap, and shined my flashlight out into the rain. The beam swept over dripping branches and the half-framed cabin. The structure looked different in the dark, less like a project and more like a broken skeleton standing crooked against the storm. My eyes kept catching on shadows between the trees. I stayed like that for a long while, just standing there with the rain soaking my hair and face, light shaking in my hand, waiting for something to move. Nothing did. Finally, I zipped the tent shut again and laid back down. Sleep didn't come easy. My ears strained at every new sound. At some point, I must have drifted off, because when I opened my eyes again, the flashlight was off, and the only light came from faint gray morning leaking through the rain clouds. But something was wrong. My tools weren't where I had left them. I remembered exactly where I had stacked them, on a tarp by the cabin's frame. When I stepped out of the tent, squinting through the rain, I saw the tarp flipped over, hammer gone, saw gone, nails scattered across the mud. My stomach dropped. Tools don't just move themselves, and the wind wasn't strong enough to flip the tarp like that. I walked slowly over to the site, my boots sinking deep into the wet ground. The prints were there in the mud, not mine, larger, heavier, heading from the tree line to the cabin frame. They weren't the clean tracks of boots, but messy, deep impressions. I knelt down, trying to see them better, but water was already filling them in, erasing their shape. I knew then I wasn't alone out here. The rain hadn't let up all morning, and everything was soaked through. My chest tightened as I thought about it. Someone had been out there in the middle of the night, close enough to take my tools, close enough to leave tracks. I scanned the woods, but the trees stood still, heavy with rain, hiding whatever had been here. I didn't stay to finish the cabin. I packed everything I could carry, shoving my sleeping bag into my pack, breaking down the tent with clumsy hands. My hammer and saw were gone, but I had a small hatchet in my pack. The handle felt reassuring in my grip, even though I wasn't sure what I would do if someone stepped out from the trees. My breath felt sharp in my chest the whole time I packed, like I was being watched. By the time I was ready to leave, the tracks were gone, washed away by the steady rain. The cabin frame stood half-finished, wood dark and dripping. I kept glancing over my shoulder as I made my way back to the logging road. My boots slipped in the mud, every noise of the forest magnified, every gust of wind making me flinch. When I finally reached my truck, the relief was so strong it made me shaky. I threw my pack in the back, climbed into the cab, and slammed the locks down. My windshield was a sheet of running water, wipers barely keeping up, but I didn't wait. I started the engine and pulled out onto the muddy track, tires spinning before they caught. As the woods thinned behind me, I couldn't shake the image of those footprints, half dissolved in the mud, and the thought of someone moving around my cabin while I slept, close enough to take things without waking me. I never went back to finish it. The cabin frame probably still stands there, rotting in the rain, swallowed slowly by the forest. Sometimes, even years later, when I think about it, I feel the same cold knot in my stomach. It wasn't the storm or the dark that scared me. It was knowing, without any doubt, that someone had been out there, watching me, and I never saw their face. That was enough. I had always liked quiet places. After years of living in the city, with its constant sirens, loud neighbors, and the hum of traffic that never seemed to fade, the thought of spending a few days out in the woods sounded perfect. It was the summer of 2016, and I was 34 at the time, worn down by work and a life that felt like it was pulling me in every direction but the one I wanted. A friend had told me about a small cabin he sometimes used in northern Minnesota. A simple one-room place with no electricity, no running water, and no neighbors within sight. Sounded rough, but that was what drew me in. I wanted silence. I wanted air that didn't smell like gasoline. I wanted the kind of dark where you could see the stars clearly. I brought my dog, Max, with me. He was a 6-year-old German Shepherd, full of energy and alert to every sound. I trusted him more than most people. Max didn't judge, didn't complain, and he never failed to make me feel safer. We drove up in late afternoon, the sky hanging heavy with clouds, though no rain had fallen yet. The dirt road that led to the cabin stretched on for miles, twisting deeper into the woods. By the time I parked, I realized how isolated the place really was. No cell service, no houses, just thick trees pressing in from every side, with a narrow clearing where the cabin sat. The cabin itself was rough but sturdy. Weather-worn logs, a tin roof that looked like it would rattle at the slightest wind, and a single front door with a rusty lock. Inside was a cot, a wood stove, a table with one chair, and shelves with old canned food I didn't trust. Dust hung in the air, stirred up when I dropped my bag. That first night felt calm. I built a fire in the stove, cooked a simple meal I'd brought, and sat on the steps with Max at my feet, listening to the woods. The quiet wasn't truly silent. It had its own rhythm. Crickets, the far-off call of a loon, the steady rustle of leaves in the wind. My shoulders relaxed in a way they hadn't in months. But as the night deepened, I noticed how absolute the darkness was. The cabin had no light but the weak glow of my lantern. And beyond that, the trees swallowed everything. Max stayed close, ears twitching at sounds I couldn't always hear. At one point, he gave a low growl, staring at the tree line. I couldn't see anything. I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon. Still, I kept the lantern burning longer than I planned before finally lying down. The next morning, I woke stiff but rested. I hiked a few miles with Max, following a narrow trail that cut through the woods. The air was fresh, damp with dew, and the forest felt endless. We didn't meet a single person. That was part of the appeal, but also unsettling when I thought about it. No one knew exactly where I was. If something happened, I'd be on my own. By the third night, the mood of the woods felt different. A storm rolled in at dusk, and rain battered the tin roof so hard it drowned out almost every other sound. Lightning flashed through the cracks in the shutters, and thunder rolled across the hills. Max paced the floor, restless, as if something was out there he didn't like. Around midnight, when the storm finally eased, I heard something distinct. A crunch of leaves and snapping of twigs just outside. Max froze, ears pointed toward the door, his body stiff. He let out a deep, guttural growl I had rarely heard from him. My heart hammered. I grabbed the lantern and stood quietly, straining to listen. The woods should have been dripping and calm after the storm, but there was movement. Slow, deliberate, too heavy for an animal like a rabbit, too irregular for a deer. It sounded like footsteps circling the cabin. I told myself it was just my imagination feeding off the storm. But Max didn't imagine things. He was locked onto the door, his growl turning sharper as the sound shifted closer to the window. I kept the lantern low, afraid to cast too much light, afraid of what I might see reflected in the glass. Minutes passed, the sounds moving from one side of the cabin to the other, then fading. I didn't sleep much that night, lying on the cot with Max beside me, listening to every creak of the cabin. The morning brought no sign of anything unusual. The ground was wet from the rain, littered with branches and leaves, but I didn't see clear footprints. Maybe they had washed away. Maybe I hadn't really heard what I thought I did. Still, something gnawed at me. That evening, I checked the door lock twice, then wedged a chair under the handle. I set the lantern on the table but kept it low. Max wouldn't settle, pacing from the door to the window, growling at nothing I could see. It was just after midnight when I heard it again. A faint crunch in the underbrush, then another. This time, no storm masked the sound. It was deliberate, steady. Someone was out there, moving in the dark. My mouth went dry. I sat rigid, listening as the steps circled once more. Max pressed against the door, barking sharply now, the sound echoing through the cabin. The steps paused. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then I heard the faintest scrape against the doorframe. My pulse roared in my ears. I tightened my grip on the lantern, every muscle ready to react. But after that scrape, the noise stopped. Whoever or whatever it was backed away into the trees. I didn't sleep again. When the sun rose, I went outside, Max running ahead. That's when I saw it. A set of footprints in the mud, clear and unmistakable. Human. They circled the cabin and stopped at the door, right where I'd heard the scrape. My stomach sank. This wasn't my imagination. Someone had been out here in the middle of the night watching. I packed up as fast as I could. I shoved my things into the bag, checked the lock one last time, and loaded Max into the truck. The drive down that dirt road felt endless, the trees pressing close as if they were keeping secrets I wasn't meant to know. Every shadow between them looked like someone standing still, waiting. By the time I reached the main highway, I finally felt my shoulders unclench. Civilization returned in the form of cars, lights, and the faint signal on my phone. Relief flooded through me, but so did a heavy unease. I had gone out there for quiet, for peace. I thought the danger of the woods was only in animals or bad weather. But standing there in the morning light, staring at those footprints in the mud, I realized the scariest thing wasn't the isolation. It was the fact that someone else had been watching me, silently circling my cabin, in the middle of nowhere, knowing I had nowhere to run. That was the last time I ever stayed in that cabin. I was 36 the first time I ever stayed alone in a cabin. It was early October of 2012, up in northern Michigan near a place called Grayling. The air carried that sharp chill that cut deeper at night, the kind that made the woods feel endless once the sun dipped below the treeline. The cabin belonged to a guy from work who had built it years back as a hunting spot but rarely used it. He let me borrow it for a long weekend after I mentioned I needed some quiet. The drive itself was long, about 4 hours north from where I lived. Most of it was two-lane highways surrounded by thick woods. By the time I reached the dirt road leading to the cabin, I noticed how isolated it really was. The gravel crunched under my tires, and the deeper I went, the more the trees seemed to close in. It was maybe a mile off the main road. No other houses, no cell service. Nothing but the sound of my engine and the occasional crow flying overhead. The cabin sat in a small clearing, single-story, weathered pine siding, with a tin roof that looked like it had been patched in a few places. A short porch stretched across the front, with 2 wooden chairs sitting unevenly on the boards. It wasn't falling apart, but it wasn't exactly inviting either. I parked beside it, unloaded my duffel bag, and carried in some firewood I had bought at a gas station earlier. Inside, it smelled like old cedar mixed with dust. There was one main room with a wood stove in the corner, a table with 2 chairs, and a small counter with a sink that ran off a water tank. A narrow hallway led to a bedroom at the back and a bathroom with an old pump toilet. The windows were small and dirty, smudged with streaks that caught the fading light of the evening. I set up my things, lit the stove, and listened to the crackle of the fire. I had packed some canned food and bread, nothing fancy. The first night, I sat on the porch with a flashlight, watching the woods go dark around me. It got quiet in a way I wasn't used to. No hum of traffic, no neighbors, no buzzing phone. Just the occasional snap of a branch somewhere in the distance, sometimes close enough that I felt my shoulders tighten. The first night wasn't too bad. I slept in the back room, though the mattress was hard and smelled faintly of mildew. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up to what sounded like shuffling outside the window. Not footsteps exactly, but movement. I lay still, staring at the ceiling, waiting for it to pass. After a few minutes it stopped, and I eventually drifted back to sleep, though not as deeply. The next day, I decided to walk around the property. The clearing was surrounded by thick pines, with a trail leading off into the woods. I followed it for about 15 minutes before turning back, not wanting to get lost. Back at the cabin, I chopped some of the wood I brought and stacked it near the porch. I noticed then that the ground below one of the windows had disturbed dirt, as if something had been pressed down into it. Probably just an animal, I thought. That night, the noises came back. This time it was clearer. Something moving near the porch, the creak of the boards like weight pressing down. I stayed in bed, listening, my heartbeat picking up. The stove had burned low, and the room felt colder. I thought about getting up to check, but didn't want to open the door and face whatever was out there. I told myself it was deer, maybe raccoons. Eventually, the sounds stopped. On the 3rd day, I started noticing small things that didn't sit right. The chair on the porch had shifted slightly, angled different than I left it. A pile of wood I stacked looked like it had been moved. Inside, I thought one of my cans of food was missing, but I told myself I probably misplaced it. By afternoon, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Even when I was inside with the curtains drawn, I felt it. That night was the worst. I was in bed, drifting off, when I heard the crunch of leaves directly outside the bedroom window. Slow, deliberate steps. My mouth went dry, and I lay frozen, straining to hear. Then came the faint sound of breathing, not mine, just on the other side of the thin wall. I didn't move, barely let myself breathe, waiting. After a while, it faded away, replaced by the distant hoot of an owl. The next morning, I checked outside. Below the window, the dirt was pressed down again, more clearly this time, an impression of a boot. Not an animal, a boot. Someone had been standing there, looking in while I slept. I felt a weight in my stomach. I locked the door, though the lock was nothing more than a flimsy latch. I thought about leaving, but the nearest town was miles away, and I didn't want to risk driving the dirt road in the dark. I told myself I would leave the next morning. I spent the day tense, every sound making me jump. When night came, I kept the fire going bright and stayed in the main room, not the bedroom. I sat with my flashlight and a heavy wrench I found in the drawer. Hours passed slowly. Around midnight, the porch creaked again. I turned off the lantern, sat in silence, listening. The sound of someone trying the latch on the front door made my chest tighten. It rattled gently, then stopped. A long pause, then the faint shuffle of steps moving around the side of the cabin. I gripped the wrench so hard my hand hurt. I thought about yelling, but my throat felt locked. Instead, I sat there waiting. The sound of the back window groaning against pressure made my skin crawl. They were testing it. But then, for whatever reason, it stopped. The footsteps faded back into the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When daylight finally came, I packed up fast. My hands shook as I threw things into the bag. I stepped onto the porch, scanning the tree line, and that's when I saw it. On the dirt road, faint tire tracks that hadn't been there when I arrived. A vehicle had come in during the night. I drove out of there without looking back, tires throwing gravel as I sped down the road. When I finally hit the highway and my phone picked up signal, I felt a wave of relief. I never reported it, never told the guy from work what happened. But the detail that stuck with me, the thing I still think about even now, was the boot print by the window. It wasn't just that someone was there. It was the size, much larger than mine. Whoever it was, they weren't just passing through. They had been standing there, watching me sleep, waiting for the right moment. That weekend taught me something I never forgot. Out there, far from anyone, there doesn't need to be ghosts or monsters to make a place terrifying. Sometimes the scariest thing in the woods is another person. Someone who knows you're alone and who doesn't want you to leave alive. I never liked the thought of being near graveyards, but in the summer of 1998, I ended up spending a night in a cabin that sat right next to one. I was 23 then, still stubborn, still careless about the things that older people told me to stay away from. The cabin belonged to my uncle, but he hadn't used it in years. It wasn't really meant for guests either. It was more like a storage place he built when he worked groundskeeping jobs near the cemetery outside Manchester, New Hampshire. I drove up there late in the afternoon, the sun still high but starting to dip. The graveyard stretched out on a slope, rows of old granite headstones leaning unevenly. Some were cracked down the middle, others covered in moss, names rubbed out from decades of weather. The cabin sat just beyond the far stone wall, hidden in a line of trees. From the road, you couldn't even see it. That was probably why my uncle used it, privacy. The place itself was small. Just one room with a table, a cot against the wall, and a wood stove that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. The air inside was stale, dusty, and it smelled faintly of old dirt and damp wood. Spiderwebs hung thick in the corners, and there were mouse droppings along the baseboards. It didn't matter to me though. I wasn't there for comfort. I just wanted a quiet place to stay the night because I had an early job helping a friend clear brush on land not too far from there. I set my backpack down on the table, unrolled my sleeping bag on the cot, and went back outside before the light completely faded. The air had that cool summer evening smell, grass and earth mixed with the faint sweetness of clover. The cemetery lay silent. Not a single car passed on the road, and no one else was around. I remember standing by the cabin door, looking across the stones. The ground dipped toward a small grove of trees, and beyond that, everything turned darker, almost black. By the time I went back inside, the sun was gone. The cabin had no electricity, so I lit the kerosene lantern my uncle left on the shelf. The flame flickered, throwing shadows against the walls. I ate a sandwich, drank some water, and sat listening to the sounds outside. The chirping of crickets, the occasional rustle of leaves, the faint croak of frogs somewhere low in the wet ground. For a while, it felt almost peaceful, but as the night deepened, something about the place grew heavier. I couldn't hear cars anymore. I couldn't hear anything except those insects and my own shifting weight on the cot. I kept catching myself staring at the single window, which looked straight toward the cemetery. The lantern glow reflected faintly in the glass, but beyond that was just black. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. I don't know why. Maybe some small noise, maybe nothing at all, but my eyes snapped open. The lantern had burned out, leaving the cabin almost completely dark. I lay there, my ears straining. That was when I noticed the crickets had gone silent. It wasn't gradual either. One moment, the noise had been steady, the next, gone. The silence pressed in hard. I sat up, listening, holding my breath. Then, faintly, I heard it crunching. Footsteps on gravel or dry dirt. Slow, measured, coming from the direction of the cemetery. I told myself it was probably just a deer, maybe even someone cutting across the property late at night, though that seemed strange. Still, I didn't move. I stayed there on the cot, my eyes fixed on the black rectangle of the window. The footsteps stopped, but the silence didn't break. That was almost worse. Minutes dragged on, and I finally forced myself to lie back down. I pulled the sleeping bag up to my chest and closed my eyes. Sleep didn't come, though. Every tiny creak of the cabin made me flinch. I turned over again and again, telling myself I was being stupid. Then came the sound again, this time closer. Dry leaves crunching, a stick snapping under weight. Definitely footsteps. I sat up fast, my heart hammering. I wanted to grab something heavy to use as a weapon, but there was nothing but the lantern and my bag. I reached for the lantern, fumbled with the matches, and struck one. The light flared, and I lit the wick. The cabin filled with that warm, shaky glow. I froze, staring at the window, and there it was, something outside, just barely caught in the corner of the light. A shadow moving along the edge of the stone wall. Tall, deliberate, not an animal. Someone. I kept staring, waiting for them to pass or show themselves, but nothing else moved. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped the lantern. I told myself maybe it was a caretaker, maybe someone who lived nearby and had a reason to be there. But the way they moved, slow, careful, it didn't feel like someone who belonged. I didn't sleep after that. I sat upright on the cot, the lantern beside me, eyes never leaving the window. Hours passed, the flame burning lower and lower. Every so often, I swore I heard faint steps again, circling. Sometimes close, sometimes farther, always keeping just enough distance that I couldn't be sure. By the time the lantern sputtered out completely, a thin gray light had started to rise outside. Dawn. The crickets returned, their sound almost shocking after the heavy silence. Birds began chirping in the trees. Everything came back to life, and for a moment, it felt like I had imagined it all. When the sun cleared the trees, I finally opened the cabin door. The graveyard lay quiet in the early light, headstones casting long shadows. I stepped outside, stiff from sitting so long, and walked toward the stone wall. That's when I saw it. Footprints, clear as anything, pressed into the soft dirt and grass along the edge of the wall. They circled the cabin. They stopped by the window. They trailed back toward the cemetery, fading into the grass between the headstones. I stood there staring until the hair on my arms rose. Whoever it was, they hadn't come up to knock, hadn't called out, hadn't done anything except watch. I packed up in less than 5 minutes. I shoved everything back into my backpack, barely checked the cot or the table, and locked the cabin door out of habit even though I knew it wouldn't matter. I didn't look back at the cemetery when I left. I never went back to that cabin again, and my uncle eventually sold the land. Years later, I still think about it, though, about how quiet everything got, how deliberate those steps sounded, how close the prints came to the window where I sat. I'll never know who was out there or what they wanted, but I know this. Someone was watching me that night, and they had no reason to be there. And that thought has stayed with me more than anything else. I was 29 the year I found myself walking down a dirt road in northern Michigan, early fall of 2008. The leaves were starting to turn. The air was cool enough that I could see my breath in the mornings, and the daylight faded quicker each day. I had been driving across the state visiting back roads and small towns, trying to take a break from everything after a bad stretch in my life. My car had started giving me trouble that afternoon. The engine kept overheating, so when I saw a faint path that cut off into the woods, I pulled over and decided to walk for a while, just to let the car cool. The trail was narrow, overgrown, but there were old tire tracks in the dirt, faded but still visible, like someone had once used it often. Curiosity got the better of me. I followed it. The woods grew denser the deeper I went, the canopy swallowing most of the daylight. After what felt like 30 minutes of walking, I saw it. An old cabin sitting crooked at the edge of a clearing. It looked abandoned. The wood was dark, weathered gray, the roof sagged on one side, and the porch steps were half broken. A metal chimney poked out at an angle. There were no signs of recent use, no parked vehicles, no cut grass, no smoke. But something about it pulled me closer. I stepped up on the porch. The boards creaked under my weight, and one gave a little too much, like it was ready to snap. The front door was closed but not locked. I pushed on it gently, and it swung open with a dry groan. Inside, the air was damp and stale, like wet earth mixed with rotting wood. The cabin had one main room with a small loft above, reached by a ladder nailed into the wall. There was a broken table in the middle, 2 wooden chairs tipped over, and a cast iron stove shoved against the far wall. The floor was scattered with old beer cans, bottles, and newspapers from the 1970s. The smell of mildew hung heavy. What struck me, though, was the silence. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Even the woods outside seemed quieter, like the trees around the cabin held their breath. I walked further in. The floor dipped under me in places, soft with rot. There was a pile of blankets in one corner, damp and chewed up by mice. A rusty lantern sat beside them. On the wall, scratched into the wood with something sharp, were marks. Long lines, like someone had been keeping count of days. Hundreds of them. My stomach tightened. Whoever had lived here had been stuck here for a long time. I pulled out my flashlight. The back of the cabin had a narrow door. I pushed it open and found a smaller room, maybe a bedroom. The mattress was collapsed in the middle, the sheets stained and black with mold. On the floor near the bed were boots. Men's, cracked leather, the laces long gone. Next to them sat a metal tin. I bent down and opened it. Inside were cigarette butts, a pocket knife, and several photographs folded together. The photos were old, color faded. A man with a mustache stood next to a woman in front of the same cabin, years earlier when it still looked intact. In another picture, the same man held up a deer he'd killed. In the last photo, the man stood alone on the porch, unsmiling, eyes dark, like he was staring past the camera. I put the pictures back, but as I did, I noticed the floorboards near the bed had been pried up at some point. There was a gap, a crawl space beneath. The smell coming from it was stronger, musty, sour, like something old had been left down there. I crouched, shining my light inside. The beam caught metal first, rusty cans, a dented cooking pot, a small shovel. Then it landed on something else. Bones. Animal bones, maybe, though they looked bigger than deer. Too big to ignore. Some were gnawed, some split open. My throat went dry. I backed away fast, hitting my head on the doorway as I stood. I needed air. Back in the main room, I noticed something I hadn't before. Near the stove was a stain on the floor, wide and dark, like it had soaked deep into the wood years ago. Around it were scratches, not neat like the tally marks on the wall, but frantic gouges, like someone had clawed at the floor with their hands. The longer I stayed, the worse the air felt, like the place wasn't just abandoned but poisoned somehow by what had happened there. My chest felt tight, and I realized how far I'd wandered from my car. I turned to leave. When I stepped onto the porch again, I froze. There were footprints in the dirt below the steps. Fresh, not mine. They were heavy boot prints, pressed deep into the soft ground, leading away into the woods. I scanned the tree line with my flashlight, but everything was shadows. The woods were still, silent. I felt the hair on my neck rise. Whoever left those prints wasn't far. I hurried back down the trail, heart pounding harder with each step. I kept looking over my shoulder, certain I'd see someone coming up behind me. I thought about the bones under the floor, the marks on the wall, the stain on the wood. I thought about the photographs, the man's dark stare. My pace quickened until I was nearly running. By the time I reached my car, the sun had slipped low, painting the trees in red light. My car sat just as I left it, hood warm to the touch. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. Turned over slow like it didn't want to, but then it caught. As I pulled back onto the road, I glanced once more toward the trail. The woods looked calm, harmless, like nothing had ever been there. But I couldn't shake the image of those fresh boot prints and the thought that someone, maybe the same man from the photographs decades ago, still walked that forest. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station 20 miles away. I sat there for a long time in the lit parking lot, hands gripping the wheel, trying to steady my breathing. The thought kept circling in my head: if I'd stayed longer, if I'd gone down into that crawl space, if I'd waited for whoever left those tracks, maybe I wouldn't have come back out of those woods. I never told anyone about the cabin. Not then, not now. But sometimes, when I drive back roads and see trails cutting into the trees, I feel that same pull of curiosity. And I force myself to keep going, because I know what waits at the end might not be empty at all. I never thought I'd write this down, but maybe putting it into words will finally get it out of my head. It happened years ago, back in 2011 when I was 26. I had rented a small cabin for a week in northern Arizona, a few miles outside Flagstaff. I'd been working nonstop in Phoenix, burning myself out at a job I didn't even like, and I thought a quiet week in the woods would fix something inside me. I pictured silence, clean air, maybe even a few hikes. The cabin wasn't fancy, just 2 rooms, a wood stove, and a deck that faced into the trees. The guy who rented it out told me the area had coyotes and the occasional bear, but nothing to worry about if I kept food sealed. The first day was peaceful enough. I unpacked, made a fire in the stove, and walked the trails behind the cabin. The air felt different there, sharper, colder, and the woods were quiet in a way that almost pressed in on me. No cars, no people, just whine through the trees and sometimes the faint crack of branches snapping far away. That night, I made pasta on the little propane stove, read a book until I was half asleep, and went to bed with the windows cracked. The second night is when things started to feel wrong. Around 1 a.m., I woke up to a noise outside. At first I thought it was wind, but then I realized it was a sort of yipping sound, high-pitched and uneven, like a coyote but not quite right. I'd heard coyotes plenty of times near Phoenix, and they have a wild, frantic chorus when they call. This was different. It was slower, broken, like something trying to copy the sound but failing. I lay still, listening. It circled the cabin, sometimes closer, sometimes farther. The hair on my arms stood up. Eventually it faded, and I forced myself back to sleep. The next morning I went outside to check. The ground around the cabin was dirt and pine needles, soft enough to catch tracks. I found prints. Some looked like normal coyote paws, but others were odd. They were longer, the toes spread wider, almost like a hand pressed into the ground. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a half-rotted paw, or maybe two tracks overlapped. I didn't let myself think too much about it. By the fourth night, the noises came again, but louder. This time it wasn't just yipping. It was breathing, heavy and uneven, close to the cabin walls. I sat in the dark on the bed, staring at the window, barely breathing. I didn't want to move, didn't want to draw attention. My phone had no service out there, so calling anyone was out of the question. I had a hunting knife with me, but that felt like nothing compared to what I imagined outside. The worst part was when I heard footsteps, not animal-like shuffling or scampering, but deliberate steps, one after another, slow and heavy. They circled the cabin. Every so often they paused right by the door and then moved on again. I didn't sleep at all that night. In the daylight, everything seemed different, like it always does, but I couldn't shake the dread. I checked again for tracks, and there were more of those strange hand-like ones mixed with paw prints. I started keeping the knife on me during the day. I even brought in the firewood from the stack outside so I wouldn't have to open the door at night. The fifth night was the breaking point. Just after midnight, I heard scratching at the side of the cabin. Not quick scratches like a raccoon, but long drags across the wood. I froze. Then came something worse, a sound that made my stomach drop. It was a voice, not clear, not human in the way you'd expect, but enough to register. Called out a single word. My name. I hadn't told anyone I was going there, hadn't given the location to anyone. Hearing my own name, mangled and drawn out in a flat, broken tone, turned my blood cold. I stayed awake till morning, gripping that knife so hard my hand hurt. By sunrise, I'd made my decision. I packed everything into my car as quickly as I could. I didn't even bother washing dishes or putting things back. I just needed to leave. Driving out on that dirt road, the trees pressing in on both sides, I kept checking the rearview mirror. Every time the road curved, I expected to see something step out into the clearing. I didn't breathe easy until I hit the main highway and saw other cars. Later, back in Phoenix, I tried to explain it to myself. I went down rabbit holes online, looking up strange animal behavior in Arizona. That's when I came across stories about skinwalkers. People described the same things, voices in the night, something walking on two legs, and for tracks that didn't make sense. But I don't think about it in supernatural terms. I can't. To me, the most likely explanation is that it was a person. Someone out there in the woods, imitating animals, trying to scare me, maybe worse. Someone who knew how to make those noises, who knew my name somehow, maybe from the rental listing or some record I didn't even realize was public. The hand-like tracks could have been a person barefoot, crouching, or wearing something on their hands. The voice? Someone practicing, stretching their throat until it sounded wrong. And the reason it chilled me so much is because a human pretending to be something else is far worse than any wild animal. An animal follows instinct. Person chooses. That's the part that stuck with me all these years. Not that I saw a monster, but that someone had been watching me out there, circling my cabin, scratching at the walls, and calling my name in the dark. They never tried to break in, never attacked, but they wanted me to know they were there. They wanted me afraid, and it worked. I never went back to that cabin. I don't even go camping anymore, not really. If I'm outside after dark and hear a noise I can't explain, my chest tightens the same way it did that week. People laugh at skinwalker stories, write them off as myths, but I know what I heard. I know what walked outside my cabin, and I know it wasn't some ghost or animal. It was a person, a real person, and that, to me, is far scarier than anything else. I was 35 the winter I decided to take a week off work and head up north to a cabin my uncle had once used for hunting. It sat in the thick woods of northern Minnesota, built back in the 70s and barely kept up since then. I hadn't been out there in years, not since I was a teenager tagging along during deer season. Back then, it always felt alive with people. Uncles, cousins, the smell of campfires and the sound of laughter. But now, all of them had drifted apart, and the place sat unused most of the time. I wanted a break from the city, a stretch of quiet where no phone or car engine could reach me. The drive was long. I left early in the morning and didn't make it down the final dirt road until late afternoon. The old logging trail was worse than I remembered. Potholes had turned into craters, and fallen branches scraped the side of my truck as I pushed through. When I finally reached the clearing, the sight of the cabin hit me harder than I expected. The wood was gray and weathered, the porch sagged, and one of the shutters hung at an angle. No smoke rose from the chimney. It was just a silent, forgotten box in the middle of nowhere. The air was cold enough that my breath showed, and the woods around me were dead quiet. No birds, no wind, just stillness. I cut the engine, and for a moment, I almost wished I hadn't come. But I had already hauled supplies, and I wasn't about to turn around after 6 hours of driving. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust and old wood. Cobwebs filled the corners, and mouse droppings littered the floor. The old hunting trophies still hung on the walls. Deer racks, a bear skull, even a fox pelt that had stiffened with age. I swept the place out, lit a small fire in the wood stove, and unpacked my gear. By the time the cabin warmed, the sun had already slipped behind the trees, leaving the woods in a dull gray. The first night was uneasy, the kind of uneasy where you don't even know why you feel it, you just do. I lay in the bunk listening to the fire crackle and the old timbers creak. Every so often, I thought I heard something outside, like a crunch of snow or a shift in the brush. But every time I sat up and held my breath, it went quiet again. I told myself it was deer or maybe raccoons. Out there, the forest never really slept. Still, I had trouble closing my eyes. The next morning, I stepped out with my rifle and pack, planning to scout around the ridge a couple miles east. The snow was shallow but crusted hard, so every step crunched loud. The forest stretched in all directions, rows of pines broken by patches of birch, the land rolling into ridges and small valleys. It was beautiful but lonely, the kind of lonely that pressed down on you. After a couple of hours, I found tracks, deer maybe a day old. I followed them for a while but turned back before noon. Something about being that far out with no one knowing exactly where I was didn't sit right. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. My cooler, which I'd left on the porch, had been dragged a few feet. The lid was popped open, and the packaged meat I'd brought was gone. At first, I thought it must have been a bear, but the tracks in the snow didn't look right. They weren't paw prints, more like boot prints, but strange, as if whoever made them walked barefoot and heavy. The toes were clear, pressed deep into the snow. I crouched over them for a long time, my rifle slung over my shoulder, listening to the silence. I told myself it had to be a stray dog or maybe a local wandering around. But I hadn't seen a house for 20 miles on the way in, and no one in their right mind would hike out here barefoot in the snow. I pushed the thought aside, locked the cabin door, and kept the rifle close the rest of the day. That night was worse. The fire had burned low, and I woke up cold. I heard something outside, slow, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin. I didn't move, just lay stiff in the bunk, staring at the ceiling. The steps crunched around the porch, then paused by the door. I could hear the faint squeak of the wood as weight pressed on it. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would echo through the walls. Whoever or whatever was out there didn't try the handle, didn't knock, didn't do anything but stand there. After what felt like forever, the steps moved away, fading into the trees. I sat up the rest of the night with the rifle across my lap, the lantern hissing low. Every little sound set me on edge. The pop of the wood stove, the whistle of wind seeping through the cracks. By morning, I felt sick with exhaustion. I thought about leaving, but the truck barely made it in, and the idea of getting stuck on the trail alone scared me more than staying put. Instead, I spent the day boarding up the windows from the inside with whatever scrap wood I found. I double-checked my ammo, cleaned the rifle, and rationed food since half of it was gone. The third night, I hardly slept. Around midnight, I heard it again. Not walking this time, but scratching, light, deliberate like fingernails against the wood. It moved along the outside wall, slow, dragging. Then silence. I gripped the rifle so tight my hands ached. In the morning, I stepped outside and saw fresh tracks in the snow, circling the cabin. Bare feet again. The prints were larger this time, pressed deep, as if whoever made them was heavier than before or leaning down low. My chest felt hollow and my throat dry. I wasn't dealing with some animal. Someone was out there watching me. By the fourth night, I was done playing defense. I set a chair by the window and kept watch, lantern low, rifle propped on the sill. The woods stretched dark and endless, the moon cutting through the pines. Hours passed. Then, near the tree line, I saw movement. A shape, tall, human, but hunched, shifting side to side like it was deciding whether to come closer. I raised the rifle, aimed, and waited. The figure stayed just beyond the clearing, swaying in the shadows. My finger rested on the trigger, my breath fogging the glass. But it never moved forward. Finally, just before dawn, it slipped back into the trees. I left the cabin the next morning. I didn't pack everything, just grabbed what I could and threw it in the truck. My nerves were shot, and every sound in the woods felt like it was closing in. The drive out was brutal, the trail chewing at my tires, but I didn't stop until I hit paved road. Only then did I let myself breathe. When I got home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been lucky. Whoever was out there, they hadn't attacked, hadn't broken in, but they could have. I thought about the bare footprints in the snow, the stolen food, the scratching on the walls. I haven't been back to that cabin since. I don't think I ever will, because sometimes the scariest thing isn't what you imagine. It's what you know is really out there, watching, waiting, and choosing not to show its full hand. I'll never forget that week I spent at the old farm cabin in southern Iowa back in 2004. I was 26 at the time, living in Omaha, working a job that left me tired of people and noise. A friend of mine told me about a cabin his uncle owned, a place out in the middle of nowhere, just farmland and dirt roads for miles. He said it was empty most of the year, just used for deer hunting in the fall. The idea of getting away from everything sounded good to me, so I packed up some food, a few changes of clothes, and drove the 3.5 hours out there. The drive was quiet, long stretches of two-lane roads where I hardly saw another car. By the time I reached the gravel road leading to the cabin, the sun was low, throwing that dull orange light across the cornfields. The cabin wasn't much, just one story, wooden walls darkened with age, and a small porch that leaned slightly to one side. Behind it was an old barn, half collapsed on one end. There wasn't another house in sight. The first night was calm. I set up my things, lit a lantern since there was no power, and listened to the sounds of crickets outside. The silence out there was heavy, broken only by the wind moving through the grass. I remember lying down on the narrow bed, thinking this was exactly what I needed. The second day I explored a little. The farm hadn't been worked in years, but there were broken fences, rusted tools left lying around, and an old tractor sinking into the earth behind the barn. The land stretched flat in every direction, except for a line of trees a few hundred yards back. I noticed right away how the soil near those trees was darker, almost black, like it had been burned at some point. I didn't think much of it then. That night was when things started to feel off. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound. It wasn't loud, just a dull thump, like someone had dropped something heavy on the porch. I froze in bed, waiting, listening. Another thump came, then silence. I told myself it was probably a branch falling or maybe an animal. I tried to sleep again, though it took a long while. The next morning, when I stepped outside, I saw something strange on the porch. There were faint marks on the wood, like something had been dragged across it. Not deep scratches, just faint lines, as if someone had scuffed heavy boots over and over. I didn't hear anyone in the night besides that sound, and I hadn't seen a single neighbor for miles, so it unsettled me. I brushed it off, told myself it was nothing. That day, I stayed closer to the cabin, just reading and writing in a notebook. But every now and then I caught myself looking toward the tree line, the one with that blackened soil. I had a nagging feeling about it, like I shouldn't walk over there. I couldn't explain why. That night it was worse. I heard the thumps again, only this time they were closer together. And then came the sound of what I swear was footsteps circling the cabin. Slow, deliberate crunching over the gravel outside. My heart was racing as I sat up in bed, straining to hear. The steps would pause, then start again, moving from one side of the cabin to the other. I didn't move, didn't make a sound, just gripped the blanket in my hands and waited. After what felt like forever, the sound stopped. I didn't hear anything else the rest of the night, but I hardly slept. The following morning, I checked the ground around the cabin. At first, I thought I wouldn't see anything, but near the side where the barn leaned, I noticed faint impressions in the dirt. Not clear footprints, just odd, uneven shapes like someone had walked around dragging their feet. I crouched down, running my hand over the marks, trying to figure out what could have made them. They weren't shaped like animal tracks, and they weren't sharp enough to be boots. They were strange, irregular, and they led toward the tree line. The wind picked up while I stood there, and I felt suddenly exposed, standing out in the open. I went back inside, locked the door, and decided I'd leave the next day. Whatever was out there, I didn't want to stick around and find out. That evening, I packed most of my things, kept only the lantern and my sleeping bag out. I didn't even cook dinner, just ate some bread and sat listening to the wind. As the sun went down, I couldn't stop checking the windows, glancing at the edges of the field where the light faded. Around midnight, it started again. The thumps on the porch, louder this time. Then the slow steps moving around the cabin. My chest tightened, and I thought about shouting, just to scare whoever was away. But something in me knew that was the wrong move. The steps moved to the back door, then to the side windows, then back to the porch. At one point, the handle of the door rattled, soft but deliberate. I sat there in the dark, holding the lantern but not lighting it, barely breathing. Whoever was out there stayed for hours. I could hear them shifting, dragging across the porch, circling again and again. It went on until just before dawn, when finally the sounds faded toward the tree line. When the sun came up, I walked outside. My hands were shaking. The dirt around the cabin was covered in marks now, dozens of them, messy and uneven. Some were wide, like someone had been crawling. They all led away from the cabin, across the field, toward that dark patch of soil near the trees. I didn't even finish packing. I threw my bag into the car, slammed the door, and drove off without looking back. The gravel road seemed longer than before, and I didn't breathe easy until I hit the highway and saw other cars. Later, when I told my friend about it, he said the cabin had always been like that. His uncle only went during hunting season and never stayed more than one night. He said there had been stories about the land, things people whispered, but he never paid attention. He laughed about it, but I could tell he didn't want to know the details. It's been years since then, and I've never gone back. Sometimes I think about those footsteps, the dragging marks, and that blackened soil by the trees. I know what I heard, and I know what I saw on the ground. I've camped plenty of times since then, but I'll never stay alone in a cabin on farmland again. There's something about that place I can't explain, and I don't need to. All I know is I left before whatever was circling me decided to do more than just walk around. I was 28 years old the first time I stayed in a cabin alone. It was the summer of 2013, and I had gone to the Peak District in England for a short break. I wanted some time away from the crowded city, away from work and people, away from the sound of buses and sirens that never seemed to stop. I booked a small wooden cabin that sat on a patch of land tucked away at the edge of a forest. It wasn't fancy at all, just a box-shaped building with 2 rooms. No television, weak electricity, and water that ran brown for a few seconds before clearing up. I arrived there in the afternoon after a long drive. The cabin sat about half a mile from a narrow road, down a dirt track where my small car barely fit. It felt isolated. You could hear the wind pressing against the trees and nothing else, not even birds most of the time. There were no other houses in sight. From the porch, all you could see was the tree-line on one side and empty fields on the other. I liked that, felt private. The first night went by without much trouble. I cooked some pasta on the small stove, read a bit from a paperback I had brought along, and then lay in bed listening to the occasional creak of the wooden walls settling in the cold. The bed was small and pushed against a wall. The sheets smelled faintly damp, but it didn't bother me too much. I actually felt relieved to be out there. The second night was different. It had been raining all afternoon. By the time it got dark, the ground outside was thick with mud, and a mist started to roll in across the fields. It clung to the grass and made the cabin seem even more cut off. I was sitting inside with a single lamp on, making some notes in a journal I carried around back then. That was when I noticed something. Out the window, past the glass smudged with rain, there was a figure standing near the tree-line. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. I blinked, leaned closer, even rubbed the glass to clear a spot from the condensation. The figure was still there. It looked like a woman, maybe middle-aged, her hair hanging down over her shoulders, her clothes dark and heavy. She wasn't moving. She wasn't walking. She was just standing at the edge of the woods, facing directly toward the cabin. I told myself it might be someone passing through, maybe a walker who had gotten caught in the rain. But the way she stood didn't look casual. Her arms were down at her sides, her body stiff. I couldn't make out her face properly through the mist, but I had the unsettling feeling that she was watching me. I pulled the curtains closed and tried to ignore it. The rain picked up, beating hard on the roof, and the sound filled the cabin. I kept telling myself that if she needed help, she would have walked up and knocked on the door. Maybe she had turned back to the road by now. Still, I found myself listening carefully for sounds outside, like footsteps squelching in the mud. Later, when I got into bed, I couldn't fall asleep. I kept picturing her face even though I never saw it clearly. My body was tense under the thin blanket. Around midnight, I finally drifted off, only to wake with a jolt at the sound of something scraping lightly against the wall of the cabin. It was slow, like branches dragging along the wood, except there were no trees close enough to touch the cabin. I stayed still, my heart pounding, and listened. The scraping moved toward the window. I didn't get up. I didn't want to look. After a while, it stopped, and eventually, I forced myself to believe it might have been an animal, maybe a fox nosing around. I fell asleep again sometime after that, though it was broken sleep, full of shallow dreams. The next morning, I stepped outside to check. The rain had stopped, the ground was wet, and the air smelled of mud. I walked around the side of the cabin, and that's when I saw them. Footprints in the mud, too small and narrow to be a man's, leading right up to the wall beneath my window. They were fresh, clear outlines of bare feet pressed deep into the wet soil.
No shoes, no boots.
Bare feet. The prints trailed back toward the tree-line before disappearing into the grass. I felt sick when I saw that. I knew it wasn't an animal. Someone had been there. All day, I kept glancing toward the woods, half expecting to see her again. I considered leaving, but my booking was for 3 nights, and part of me tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was some local eccentric, maybe a homeless woman wandering the area. I didn't want to overreact. I stayed, but I made sure to lock the door and wedge a chair under the handle that night. That evening dragged on slow. I didn't turn on many lights, worried they would make me visible from the outside. I sat with a blanket around me, listening to the ticking of my watch, trying to read but not really processing any of the words. As the hours passed, the silence outside grew heavy. Then, around 11, I heard it again, the scraping on the wall. This time it was louder, longer, moving deliberately along the side of the cabin. I sat frozen, gripping the arms of the chair. The sound reached the window, paused, and then I heard a faint tapping, like fingernails against the glass. I couldn't bring myself to look. My mouth went dry, and I just sat there in the dark, holding my breath. After what felt like an eternity, the tapping stopped. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound made me flinch. When the sun finally came up, I waited a couple of hours before gathering my things. I didn't even bother making breakfast. I just packed quickly, carried my bag to the car, and checked around the cabin one last time. Near the window, in the mud, there were more footprints. The same bare feet, pressed deeply into the soil, but this time closer together, as if the person had stood there for a long time. Driving away down that narrow dirt track, I kept checking the mirror. The woods grew smaller behind me until they disappeared completely. I didn't stop until I reached a petrol station miles away, where the sound of traffic and people's voices finally felt safe again. I never told anyone the full story back then because it sounded too strange. No one would believe a barefoot woman had been circling the cabin at night, watching me through the window, scraping her nails along the wood. But I know what I saw and I know what I heard. Even now, years later, I still think about those footprints pressed into the mud, the way they faced directly toward the cabin, like whoever it was had been standing there waiting while I sat inside pretending not to notice. That was the last time I ever rented a cabin alone. I hadn't been back to that part of the mountains in almost 12 years. Not since Mark and I split. We had built that little cabin together in the late 90s using borrowed tools, cheap lumber, and sweat we didn't have to spare. He always wanted a place far from people, somewhere only a dirt road and stubbornness could reach. After the divorce in 2009, he kept it and I never looked back. But when I got the call that he had died, alone, heart attack at 54, They told me his cabin was still standing, filled with his things. Nobody else wanted to make the trip up there. No kids, no family, just me. I didn't want to go either, but something in me felt I should at least see it one last time. Maybe grab a few old things before the place rotted down into the soil. It was late October of 2021 when I drove up. The road was worse than I remembered. Potholes had grown into craters, weeds clawed at the edges, and the dirt had washed out in places where the rain carved gullies down the hillside. I had to park the truck half a mile down and hike the rest of the way, just like we used to do when the snow got too deep. The air was damp and sharp, the kind that sticks to your lungs. The cabin sat in a little clearing, surrounded by tall pines that leaned in like they wanted to swallow it whole. It looked smaller than I remembered, sagging at the corners. The roof had dark streaks from years of storms, and the porch boards were soft with rot. The place felt wrong, not because of anything supernatural, but because it was like stepping into a memory that hadn't aged right. Like seeing a childhood home gutted and abandoned. The lock was rusted, but I managed to force the door open. The smell hit me first: damp wood, mildew, and old ash from the stove. Inside, everything was almost exactly the same. His hunting jacket hung by the door, stiff with dust. The little iron stove sat cold in the corner, still surrounded by a ring of firewood stacked like it was waiting for him. The table was cluttered with half-empty coffee cans filled with screws and bolts, the same way he always kept them. I walked through the room slowly, my boots echoing on the warped floorboards. The bedroom was a mess of unwashed sheets, piles of clothes, and stacks of old magazines. The bathroom sink was cracked, and a line of dead flies lay in the tub. In the back room, the one we had built as a kind of storage shed, I found shelves of mason jars filled with cloudy water, some with rust floating inside. A pile of old deer antlers leaned in the corner, dust thick enough to write my name in. I should have just taken a box or two of his things and left, but I lingered. Every corner carried a piece of my past. Every nail in the walls felt like something we had put there together. But the longer I stayed, the more I felt unsettled. It wasn't anything you could point to directly, it was just a feeling. The silence was heavy, the kind that makes you realize how far you are from anyone else. No neighbors, no cell signal. If something happened here, nobody would hear a thing. As I moved through the cabin, I kept noticing small details that didn't make sense. A chair dragged across the floor in the wrong spot. A broken plate on the counter, but no sign of it being cleaned up. A blanket crumpled on the ground near the stove, like someone had been sleeping there. I told myself maybe Mark had been messy in his last years. Maybe he just let the place go. But the hairs on my arms stood up anyway. Outside, it was already growing dark. The trees seemed to close in tighter around the clearing. I went back in to pack a few things, planning to leave before the light was gone completely. But as I stuffed some of his old photos into a bag, I noticed something that stopped me cold. On the kitchen counter, next to the broken plate, was a can of beans. It wasn't dusty like everything else. The label was bright, clean, new. I picked it up, and the expiration date said 2024. Mark had been dead for almost a year. My first thought was that maybe a hunter had been squatting here. Maybe kids sneaking up into the mountains. But that didn't settle my nerves. In fact, it made things worse. Because if someone had been using this cabin, they could still be here. I forced myself to check the pantry. Sure enough, tucked behind the old canned goods were 2 or 3 newer ones. Different brands, all still good. My chest tightened. I moved quickly, searching for more signs. That blanket near the stove, it smelled faintly of smoke, like it had been used recently. There were boot prints near the door, faint in the dust, not mine and not Mark's. That was enough for me. I grabbed my bag and decided to leave right then. No second guessing. But when I opened the door, I stopped again. Out at the edge of the clearing, near the tree lean, I saw something pale in the dirt. I squinted. It was a paper plate. From a distance, I could see a smear of food dried on it. And right beside it, a newer-looking boot print in the mud. I didn't go check it. I just pulled the door shut behind me and started down the trail as fast as I could without breaking into a full run. My heart pounded hard enough to drown out the crunch of leaves under my boots. The shadows between the trees seemed thicker than before, and every snap of a twig made me jerk my head around. The whole way down, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I didn't see anyone. No voices, no shapes moving in the dark. Just silence and the faint drip of water from the trees. But that silence was worse than noise, because it let me imagine someone walking just far enough behind me to stay hidden. By the time I reached the truck, the sky was nearly black. I fumbled the keys twice before I got the door unlocked. I didn't look back once I was inside. I just started the engine and drove. I didn't stop until I hit pavement again, miles down the mountain. I never reported it. I didn't want to explain to anyone why I had been up there, or what I thought I saw. Maybe it really was just some drifter using the cabin. Maybe they were gone already. But I can tell you one thing for certain. Mark's old place isn't empty. Someone's been living there, quiet as the trees, waiting in that silence. And I'll never go back again. I was 34 when I rented that cabin in northern Montana. It was the fall of 1998, the air sharp with cold in the mornings, the kind that makes your breath look like smoke. I had taken a 2-week leave from work after burning myself out, and a coworker told me about this place. Cheap, off the grid, no phones, no distractions. It sounded like exactly what I needed. The cabin sat at the end of a long gravel road, the kind where you drive for miles without seeing another house. Tall pine trees pressed in on both sides, the canopy so thick in some parts it looked like dusk even in the middle of the day. When I pulled up in my old Chevy pickup, the cabin looked smaller than I expected. The logs were weathered gray, and the tin roof was spotted with rust. There was a small porch, a single rocking chair, and one window with old curtains that looked stiff with dust. Inside, it was simple. One main room with a fireplace, a small kitchen with a gas stove, and a back room with a cot that sagged in the middle. The air smelled like damp wood and old smoke. I dropped my duffel bag, opened the windows to let some air in, and tried to settle into the silence. The first night was calm. I built a fire, cooked some canned soup, and read by flashlight until I fell asleep on the cot. The quiet was heavy, but I liked it. No city noise, no phones, no people. Just the crack of logs and the sound of wind sliding through the trees. By the third day, I noticed something. Every morning, just after sunrise, I'd find small things moved. First, I thought I was careless. My boots, which I had left by the door, were turned sideways like someone had nudged them. A can of beans I could have sworn I left on the counter was sitting on the floor near the sink. Once, my duffel bag was unzipped when I knew I had closed it. I told myself it was me. Maybe I was tired. Maybe I was forgetting things. That explanation worked until the 5th night. That night, I woke up to the sound of something outside. It wasn't an animal. I knew that much. I grew up hunting in Wisconsin, and I know the difference between a deer stepping through brush and a person's foot dragging across leaves. This was slow, deliberate circling. My fire had burned low, the room dim and flickering. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, every muscle locked. The sound stopped for a long time. Just when I thought I was imagining it, I heard a soft thud against the porch, like someone had placed their boot down gently, testing the wood. I stayed awake until daylight, my hand gripping the hunting knife I brought with me. The next morning, I walked outside and looked around. The ground was damp from rain, and in the mud near the side of the cabin, I saw prints. Not boots, bare feet, large ones. The toes had sunk deep into the mud, the stride wide like whoever made them had been pacing back and forth. I didn't like that at all. The nearest town was about 20 miles away, and I didn't have a phone in the cabin. I had a CB radio in my truck, but the signal didn't reach far in the mountains. I thought about leaving right then, but pride kept me there. I told myself it was probably kids messing around, though I hadn't seen another soul since I got there. Still, I started keeping my truck keys in my pocket, even when I went to bed. 2 nights later, things escalated. I was sitting by the fire, writing in a notebook, when I heard the porch creak. Not faintly this time. Heavy, deliberate weight on the boards. My heart started hammering. I reached for my knife, then remembered the .22 rifle I had leaning against the wall. I grabbed it and sat frozen, staring at the door.
No knock.
No voice, just silence. Then a slow scrape, like fingers dragging across the wood of the doorframe. I shouted then, just a raw sound from my throat, hoping it would scare whoever it was away. The scraping stopped. For a long minute, nothing. Then the sound of retreating steps down the porch, fading into the woods. I didn't sleep that night. Every crack of the fire made me jump. By the time the sun came up, I had made up my mind to leave. I packed my bag, loaded my truck, and was about to start the engine when I noticed something on the side of the cabin. Scratches. Long, deliberate scratches in the logs at eye level. Not animal scratches, these were straight, deep, and controlled, like someone had dragged a knife across the wood again and again. Driving out, I kept checking my mirrors. The gravel road twisted through the trees, and every shadow felt like it was hiding something. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station in town. I went inside, bought coffee just to have an excuse to stand around people, and asked the cashier if anyone lived out that way. She looked at me for a long moment before saying no, not for years. She mentioned an old man who used to squat in those woods, someone who refused to leave even after the land was bought up. Said he'd been seen wandering barefoot on the roads sometimes, staring at cars as they passed. Nobody knew if he was still around. Some said he was dead. Some said he just lived out there, slipping between trees like smoke. I didn't go back to the cabin. I drove straight home to Wisconsin, and I never rented a place that remote again. For weeks afterward, I had nightmares of those scratches and the sound of slow steps on the porch. Even now, when I think about it, the part that gets me the most isn't the footsteps or the scratching. It's the boots by the door, the unzipped bag, the can of beans moved onto the floor. Those things happened when I wasn't awake. That means at least once, whoever it was had been inside the cabin while I was sleeping. And I'll never know how many nights I wasn't alone.